So we don't have very good socioeconomic data on how people use water, access water.
We've seen some back of the envelope calculations, like for Peninsular India, which says that if you have a house in peri-urban Bangalore and you have to drill a well to 1,000 feet, you're probably better off just buying tanker water for the rest of your life.
A lot of research focuses on the first and the second best, not on the third, fourth, and sort of fifth kind of best, right? And that's got to do with the publication bias. It's just hard to publish things that are not sexy, so to speak. But policy is often about the third, fourth, and fifth best. And so we do need to do more research, more practical, action-oriented research in that space.
Welcome to the Water Data Podcast, where we talk about the science, the stories, and the systems that shape our water future. I'm your host, Vijay Doiphode. Every couple of weeks, we'll chat about how better data and evidence can result in better decision-making and ultimately better outcomes for people and the planet. So if you're a student, a researcher, an innovator, a practitioner, or just curious about how we can better manage this precious resource, you've come to the right place. Let's get started. On this episode with Dr. Soumya Balasubramanya, my colleague Pavan Srinath will be joining me as a co-host. Hi, I'm your host, Veena Srinivasan.
And I'm Pavan Srinath. So on this episode, we are delighted to be talking to Dr. Soumya Balasubramanya. Soumya is a senior economist with the World Bank and previously a senior researcher in environment and development economics at the International Water Management Institute, IWMI, at CGIAR. So Soumya, welcome to the show. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Soumya, it's really a delight to be able to speak to you. It's been a few years since we had a chance to actually delve into some of these issues around groundwater. And I remember the last time we spoke was maybe during a few years ago. And one of the things that I remember that we were on a panel discussion together about was kind of thinking about groundwater and you bringing in your perspective as an economist and thinking about sort of the carrots and sticks and how do we manage groundwater with carrots and sticks. And I was wondering whether we could kick off our discussion by having you speak to some of that.
This was Stockholm Water Week. I think we did this nice panel discussion. There was you, there was Dustin Garrick at Waterloo, and he's done a lot of work on sort of groundwater markets. You were coming in with your perspective on sort of the hydrological perspective that you bring in, but also the policy relevant work that you have done in India, including trying to think about how to move these principles of management into practice, especially in a complex structure where you have sort of a federal, a state, a local government. I remember you were talking about that. And I would think I was kind of just, I think for me, it was one of those things where I think I was learning a lot from that conversation and thinking about how people think about these things and how different disciplines where do they start from the problem. If you're a hydrologist, you tend to sort of come at it from a biophysical perspective, thinking about, recharge, thinking about sustainable yields. Economists kind of tend to think about how do you maximize incomes. And again, within economics, it's kind of, there'll be those who talk about maximizing yield versus those who maximize livelihoods versus those who talk about equity and distribution. There are such different things. They're not even the same goalposts sometimes that you're changing. And I think that was what was interesting to me. So since that conversation, sort of done more work on groundwater in India than I did before that conversation, oddly enough. So I think, in a sense, it was a primer. And in many ways, I think it's kind of the challenge in general is that, we have a resource that, and we should acknowledge that the use of groundwater is perhaps what, even if the monsoons were to fail in India, you wouldn't have a famine. And you wouldn't have a famine because people have access to that groundwater. And that's what's led to food security. That's what's led to the fact that we can feed our populations and export food. And I think those are the big benefits that have come from this use of groundwater. And we don't say it often enough, and we should. On the flip side, it also means that we are using up a resource. And in many parts of India, we sort of know what the problem is, particularly in the north, but it's increasingly a problem in Peninsula. It's increasingly a problem in pockets of Bengal, where groundwater levels are falling and well depth is going down and people have to drill sort of, deeper in order to pull water out, or energy costs of extraction go up, etc. And in a sense, that's the conundrum, right? How do you rationalize, and I'm going to use the word rationalize, I'm not going to use the word sustainable, because in part, I don't know how you translate a principle of sustainability as economists talk about it into practical language. So I'm not going to use that word. But I think everybody agrees that the resource needs to be managed better than what we are doing at the moment. And I think the conundrum really is, how do you manage this resource in an environment where millions of farmers use it? And most of these farmers are very small. They are very poor. And what are the practical things that we can do against a history where we haven't really done much to manage groundwater, right? We haven't really metered wells. People don't pay governments for money for groundwater, and energy is subsidized. That doesn't mean people don't pay for water, because as we know, a lot of farmers in India don't have their own wells. They actually buy water from the big guy next to them. But there is a difference between paying my bigger farmer neighbor for water versus paying the government for water. And I think when we talk about management, we tend to kind of think about the regulator or the government stepping in and doing something about it. And it is true that in India, we have sort of, 60, 70 years of history where none of that has happened. And so the question then becomes, how do you rationalize the use of energy and water? Because you need energy to pull out groundwater at the end of the day. And how do you do it in a way that's not regressive? And by regressive here, I mean that let's assume we were to put some kind of policy into place that either puts a price on water or restricts the quantity of water that can be pulled out. Is it going to affect larger farmers more, or is it going to affect smaller farmers more in the detrimental space? And if smaller farmers are going to be affected more detrimentally, that policy would be a regressive policy. Now, we don't know the answer to this question, but it is not unreasonable to assume that some of the measures that we have on board might be regressive. But the thing is, we just don't know. And there's also likely to be considerable variation in how regressive these policies are from state to state in India, and even within states in India. So, for example, in a place like Punjab, maybe things might not be so regressive. But in a place like Chhattisgarh, it very well might be. But we don't know the answer to this. And I think we need to figure these answers out in order to have any reasonable discussion, on what can be that step in policy that we practically move forward. So I think there are a whole bunch of knowledge gaps here that we still need to kind of answer, or else we keep talking about these kinds of solutions, which they're just it's a lot of buzzwords without necessarily adding anything meaningful to the larger discourse.
Yeah. I have a follow-up question. One of the things that you don't hear being talked about enough, it's like people talk about paying for the water, but sometimes we don't talk about the cost of drilling. And sometimes, we've seen some back of the envelope calculations, like for Peninsula India, which says that if you have a house in peri-urban Bangalore and you have to drill a well to 1,000 feet, you're probably better off just buying tanker water for the rest of your life. That's actually cheaper. And one of the costs that we never talk about is the cost of competitive drilling, and that's all investment by private farmers. And we tend to talk about like marginal costs. And I was wondering whether you had is there any way to kind of regulate through the cost of, the capital cost, or is the incentive always through the cost of pumping?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would imagine in an environment where what you can and cannot do is somewhat historically you're constrained, I would imagine you would need to do multiple things. It's not just going to be the one thing, but there'll be like 5 or 6 different things that you need to do at the same time. Economists would argue that, you would need a price on sort of the marginal cost of water, that is, as you use water, in order to have efficiency in use. Or else, if you were to think about, for example, making it harder for people to drill wells, in principle. The challenge is it's going to be harder for poorer people to drill wells, not richer people to drill wells. So that policy itself might be quite regressive. If we are worried, and I should say here that part of what I do is worrying about trade-offs. So we want to manage environmental resources better, but we're also doing it in a context where there's a lot of poverty and the poor depend on it. So a big chunk of my research is looking at these trade-offs. If we want to manage this resource better, what are the consequences for the poor? Or for that matter, it also goes the other way around. Sometimes better management can alleviate poverty. Sometimes our more traditional ways of management could make things worse for the poor. And I'm agnostic about which way this can go. I just look at the evidence and try to understand what's happening in that particular context.
So I was wondering, why don't you see more discussion of like shared infrastructure and collectivization and that sort of, why is it that the regressive aspects can't be controlled through that sort of thing?
Yeah. So somebody like Beena Agarwal, for example, would say exactly that, right? So Beena's work has looked at can you solve some of these larger issues by collectivizing productive assets, etc. It may or may not work depending upon where you are. So for example, in India, a state like Punjab, there is no point in thinking about collectivizing production and assets. It's just too far down the line. Places in India where poverty is more deeply entrenched, there may be opportunities to do that, where you could have collectivization of assets and people come together to drill a pump, etc., in order to put it down, and everybody doesn't have to individually drill a well. But that will also require a little bit of creative planning, in a sense, in order to get these kinds of initiatives into place. And I think one of the challenges that we do have in order to mobilize these things is it's two things. One, it's the lack of data. So we don't have very good socioeconomic data on how people use water, access water. Like take, for example, the minor irrigation census, which happens in India every few years. And it does a very good job of kind of understanding who's using what, etc. But to the best of my knowledge, the minor irrigation does not ask farmers if they purchase water from other people. So think about things like informal groundwater markets, right? We know that they are quite ubiquitous across South Asia, not just India, but South Asia. In fact, they're even there, and I've worked in Northern Africa, I've worked in the MENA region. You have water markets everywhere of different sorts. But they're surprisingly very badly studied. And so the minor irrigation census misses a very nice opportunity to ask even, a series of 10 questions on if you use groundwater, are you buying your water from somebody? How are you paying for it, right? Because marginal farmers will pay the well owner. They're either paying in terms of the hours of pumping. Sometimes payment is by the area that's irrigated. These arrangements vary depending upon where you are. Just understanding these kinds of arrangements would be extremely helpful. Simply to understand the extent to which these informal markets are there. Because you see, as a regulator, if I were to come in and propose some regulation from the government space on either how much of water can be extracted, or do you need a permit to drill a well, or let's even assume in some very creative world, putting meters and pricing water, or energy for that matter. The extent to which these policies will affect the poor will depend upon the penetration of these informal markets. And so, in a sense, we can't even begin to talk reasonably about what we can do to regulate unless we first understand the problem a bit better. So I think that's the challenge that we're suffering from. And in a sense, we've been talking about about what to do moving forward in an environment where I don't think we necessarily understand the dimensionality of the problem well enough. And so I would first motivate anybody who's thinking about this problem, either in the policy space or the research space, to better understand the dimensionality of this problem, which is that you have extensive informal groundwater markets. We don't quite understand how they work. There are some pockets of studies, for example, J.B. Meenakshi and Abhijit Banerjee study informal markets and try to understand how does this market work? Is it competitive? Is it monopolistic pricing? What's going on? But it's a small sample study. And given the fact, the size of India particularly, these markets are going to vary very, very rapidly depending upon where you are. And this has consequences for policy. So, for example, Gujarat and Punjab both tried this kind of pani bachao paisa kamao kind of a thing, right? Where you're giving the farmer, again, you've had free electricity and water, you can't really price it. It's not only is it politically contentious, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that it is incredibly hard logistically to start putting meters and hundreds of millions of. I mean, how are you going to do this, right? It's just the transaction costs of doing it are going to be so large, it may not even justify what you get at the end of the day. So the regulators in both these states tried to kind of turn the problem around their head, and they said, okay, if we can't price electricity and water, let's give the farmers who are using electric wells, let's put a meter on these electric wells. These were both pilot initiatives, just to see how it works. Put a meter on the well so that we know how much of energy the pump is drawing. We'll give them an entitlement of electricity. And it's very hard setting an individual entitlement when meters have never been there in the past. So even the regulator is kind of trying to arrive at how much entitlement should I give at this farm to this farmer. I mean, it's a very noisy calculation, so to speak. But they did it anyhow, and they said, let's see what happens. So the idea is that you have an entitlement of electricity as a farmer. If you don't use your entire entitlement, we will buy the electricity back from you. So you have some incentive to not pump. That's the whole idea. And so they tried it in Gujarat and they tried it in Punjab. And in Gujarat, you see no changes in pumping behavior. But in Punjab, you do, at least in this pilot setting. And the one big difference between these two areas is that in the place where this was piloted in Gujarat, you have very extensive informal groundwater markets. So you have big well owners. So one is the well is collectively owned, and there are 6 or 7 people who own the well because these are very deep wells. And then these well owners are pumping and selling water to smaller farmers who cannot afford to have their own well. So in this environment, even a creative scheme such as this doesn't fly, because farmers will have to continue pumping for their neighbors. And frankly, it also gives them an opportunity to raise prices for the water that they're charging to their neighbors, because now they can kind of say, hey, you have to pay me more, because if you don't pay me more, I can go and sell this electricity back to the grid. So the thing is, when informal markets are present and you try to introduce some regulation, what you run into is, in a sense, two markets that are, for the lack of a better word, interacting with each other, and how welfare gets redistributed is not known. And it's the same thing for things like collectivization, right? If we were to think about, let's say, collectivizing, you already have an environment in which these informal markets are there. Land we know is fragmented. Land we know is non-contiguous. As a farmer, I may own 4 pieces of land which are not even together. Collectivization becomes much harder, because then you have to kind of be like, okay, I have to give up your land and you have to give up my land. And then how do we kind of go about collectivizing? I think until we understand these kinds of things a bit better, it becomes very hard to move any of these into any practical space without understanding what the consequences or the unintended consequences can be. I think that's the challenge. Yeah.
So, Soumya, I fully agree with you that how understudied so many challenges in India are, right? I mean, we are a data scarce nation in most things. Just, on the flip side, I've also written a lot of research which calls for more research, right? So, given the state of data, what do you think are some things that India can do right now when it comes to groundwater management? And we're talking about management in an irrigation context, right? What are some things that we can do with the knowledge that we have? What are some steps that hopefully will be better for us than, where the trade-offs make sense?
Yeah.
Even if the answer varies state by state, what are some ideas that you think we should be thinking of consciously?
I mean, I think in this environment, you could certainly think about things like low regret, no regret options. And the other thing is you need to have a slightly longer term perspective, when you start thinking about what is it that you can do. You're not going to have any discernible change on groundwater levels until you change the right rice wheat paddy, the rice wheat system like in Punjab and Haryana. That has to really change, right? But cultivating rice and wheat makes sense to farmers. So unless you develop other value chains that are also profitable for farmers, which could be, maybe it could be vegetables, maybe it could be fruits, maybe it could be, people keep talking about lentils, legumes, etc. But until it's profitable for a farmer to be able to do that, I don't expect to see any big discernible shifts here, right? Because ultimately, in the end of the day, I don't think a farmer is tied to cultivating wheat or rice. They are cultivating wheat or rice because that's what makes sense for them to do. It's profitable or less risky, depending upon whether you're in a profit maximizing space or you're a smallholder farmer, in which case there's a lot of risk aversion and you just want to play safe. One of those two things generally happens, right? But in both cases in India, cultivating wheat and rice is the logical thing to do. So until we make it profitable for people to cultivate other things, I don't expect to see any discernible shift happening. Now, that calls for long-term thinking and strategy. So it calls for extension to be developed in these other spaces, working with farmers in order to move them out of these practices and cultivate other crops. Potentially, any kind of change in cultivation practices means incomes will fluctuate during the time people figure out how to make this profitable for them. You may need to offer what we call bridge insurance, and by which I don't mean insurance programs, but it might even be something as simple as cash for work, food for work kind of programs that are there in those 5-6 years as farmers make these changes. It's the same with things like technology. So take, for example, something like AWD, right? Alternative wet and drying of rice, which uses considerably less water for rice cultivation than flooding the field. So for those who don't know what AWD is, it's a small pipe. It's a small pipe which is perforated. It's about, say, 30 centimeters long. You stick it into the mud. And let's say about 10 centimeters of the pipe is above the ground and 15 centimeters or 20 centimeters is below the ground. You pour water into the field to cover the pipe, right? And then you only irrigate when you use a stick, because the pipe is hollow. And you put the stick into the pipe and you irrigate again only when the water is 25 centimeters down from the top of the pipe. So the idea is that you flood your field in those between, only when the water goes down to that level. So that means that the farmer has to figure out what is the optimal period of time between two irrigations. Now, that optimal period of time, if you look at the AWD guidelines, it will say about 7 days. But to be honest, it can vary. It depends on the soil, it depends on the humidity, it depends upon the season, it depends on a whole bunch of things. And so sometimes it could be every 5 days, it could be every 12 days sometimes. There's considerable variation in what that could be in the real world. Now, when AWD is introduced to a farmer and you say every 7 days, and they sort of take that as gospel and then do it every 7 days, there is a fairly good chance that there'll be yield fluctuation, by which we mean yield will fall. Now, the minute that happens, the farmer is not incentivized to do it next season, because he'll say, hey man, you told me to do this stuff and I did it every 7 days and my yield went down by 15%. Now, a 15% yield loss for a smallholder, average farm size in India is very small. I mean, large farms are in Punjab, and even there are 3 to 4 hectares, which are frankly small farms globally. The average farm holding in India is half a hectare. It's so tiny. Now, in half a hectare, if you have 15% lower yield, that's actually a big thing for a farmer. And so we cannot think about expanding AWD unless we offer better extension, so more village-specific, advisory rather than these generic sort of kinds of terms. But also we may have to throw in some kind of bridge programs, like a cash for food or a work for food, for food kind of program, in the 3 or 4 years it takes the farmer to experiment to figure out what is that optimal period between irrigations on his plot that he can continue using. So better extension certainly is going to be the case. Some sort of collaborative approach where, it's not just about the technology, it's also about kind of securing all kinds of other losses that farmers can potentially have when they shift technology. That's going to be the case. So we need to start. So there are a bunch of things that we could be doing, but we're not doing them either. And I think, in a sense, if we think about it, if we really do want to move into things like pricing, better pricing of electricity, better pricing of water, the question is, what are those revenues going to be used for, right? So is it the case that the government will collect those revenues and use it to better manage aquifers, because there are things that can and need to be done beyond the farm level by a regulator at the level of the aquifer that allows recharge to happen. There are things that the regulator can do in terms of landscape management that in general allow soil moisture to be better retained. Now, when plot sizes are so small, the economies of scale are not there for farmers to individually do things on their own land. So is the regulator going to use these revenues in order to say, okay, before the start of every cultivation season, we are going to come and run these tractors on these lands and level them so that, we know that we can have better and more efficient use of natural resources. And we'll do it on our ticket because we are raising money from farmers and this is a service that we just provide. So I think there are things that we could be doing and we're not doing that, and we should be doing more of that as well. And I think it's going to be really important to kind of, it's always a chicken and the egg problem, right? I mean, do you do this first or do you do that first? I actually think we just need to start doing everything at the same time. So when people say, oh, farmers don't want to pay for water or electricity, right? Actually, the vast majority of farmers buy their water from a bigger farmer. They are paying for water. They're just not paying the government for water. They're paying some big farmer for water. So the question becomes, why are farmers reluctant to pay government? Right? And is it because, in general, the history has been to let farmers kind of figure it out on their own, and people have gotten used to figuring things out on their own. So I think it's a systemic issue, and it needs to there are a bunch of things that need to happen at the same time for this mentality to change. And a lot of it is trust. It's also trust. And so when governments provide services that people can rely on, trust builds. So I think if we do need to solve the problem, we are going to have to kind of provide reliable services and extension, advisory, other support services that enable farmers to say, I can take a gamble and make this switch because, there is a safety net for me and somebody will hold me if this doesn't work out. That's what's needed.
Are you enjoying this episode? If you are, please hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. Your reviews on Spotify and Apple Podcasts will really help us out. And if you can think of a friend, a colleague, or a fellow water enthusiast who might enjoy it, please do share this episode with them. We hope to reach many more changemakers like you. I think, you've written a lot about solar irrigation, and of course, India's own specific brand of solar irrigation, which is, that you're paying, you're basically offering buyback of electricity, and states are offering buyback of electricity. And I just wondered whether you want to speak, because that's a different form of kind of creating a price for water, right?
Yeah.
Apart from the straight up cash for blue, or Pani Bachao Paise Kamao type of schemes.
Yeah.
But I was wondering whether you wanted to comment a little bit on whether you see a difference between the solar scheme way of incentivizing production and the Pani Bachao Paise Kamao, and where do you see the similarities and differences there?
So I think you're right. In a sense, they are quite similar. All you're doing is creating an opportunity cost on pumping. That's kind of what you're doing, right? Either way, you give a farmer an entitlement of electricity and say, you don't have to pump everything, boss. I'll buy it back from you if you don't pump. So there's a reason to not pump. And in the case of solar, it's kind of like, we'll put a solar panel on your field. You have an electric pump. We'll net meter you. And again, you can choose to decide if you want to be a net electricity user or a net electricity seller through that net metering scheme, right? Either way, it's basically trying to, at the margin, you're trying to create some incentive on whether you pump or whether you don't pump. That's sort of what all these schemes are doing. It's just different ways to go about it. There is a difference, though, in the other things that the government is trying to achieve. You see, one of the big reasons why solar would be attractive to a country like India, which has subsidized energy to a large extent and provides a lot of free energy, is that it changes the nature of the subsidy. Demand for energy is increasing in agriculture. Right? More people want to irrigate, more people need energy, more farmers need energy, all kinds of things are happening, partly because of climate change. I need to irrigate more than I did before. Rainfall is not at the same time, so I need to pump more than I did before, for whatever, and just population in general, right? So energy demand is going up. So status quo in business as usual, states that supply free electricity would have to provide more free electricity, which is fiscally very, very burdensome. The minute you bring solar in, you change the nature of the subsidy mix. Because what you're doing is, solar panels is what? It's a one-time capital cost subsidy. Even if you were to give it away at a highly subsidized rate, it's a one-time capital cost subsidy. And then you have something that's generating power. And so you're changing the nature of the subsidy mix, so to speak. So the one advantage of going solar is it does help it can, in principle, help the government reduce its fiscal burden than compared to what it would be otherwise. So the fiscal burden is still increasing over time. It's just that into the future, you're changing sort of the slope of the slope of the line, so to speak, right? So fiscal burden is going to increase. The question is, how much can we control that increase? And solar kind of allows you to do that. That's kind of what's
and then, of course, you get to claim decarbonization of your electricity as well, which is a big part of it.
Yeah, but it's avoided emissions, not actual mitigation, right?
Yeah.
And so,
but that is significant. That is real carbon. It's not made up.
I think my perspective on this is slightly different. It's all very well to talk about avoided emissions, but nobody knows what would have happened. So I think it's fine to say we are avoiding emissions by doing this, or else we would have.
It doesn't solve the climate problem. There's already enough carbon in the air, and it's not replacing.
It's not replacing anything, and it's also. I have yet to see the actual supply of non-renewable energy fall. What's happening is that perhaps maybe the supply of non-renewable energy or the production of non-renewable energy is also increasing. Maybe it's increasing at a lower rate than it would have had otherwise. So again, these are all into the future, what might have happened kind of things, and all fair and well. We're not disputing the importance of that, but I think I feel the need, at least in my head, to contextualize that and remember that this is really a hypothetical scenario into the future. We don't really know what would have happened, but okay, be that as it may. But again, right? But the thing about solar is because the marginal cost of pumping is zero, you have it, you can do whatever you want with it, which is why things like net metering are being suggested as solutions, to sort of say, okay, you don't always have to pump. You can also earn some money by selling electricity back to the grid. And the question is that, I think the question that everybody has is that quote unquote enough of an incentive to prevent quote unquote over exploitation of groundwater? And I'm deliberately using quote unquote because these are fairly loaded words. We don't know. That's the answer. And the reason why we don't know is because, you see, if there is so much of heterogeneity among farms and farmers. So for example, if I am a farmer who now gets a solar pump, or who gets a solar panel, right? I have a solar panel now, and I am now net metered. There are other things that I could change about my production. I could change the kind of crop I want to cultivate. I could change the area under cultivation. I might have had land that I was not cultivating before, but I might say, okay, let me add this, little bit of land and cultivate a bit more. I might cultivate more number of seasons of crops. That's also possible. So in the net, we don't really know whether this is, and yes, I can also sell electricity back to the grid. So all of those, so what solar does is, by changing the pumping technology and putting in this net metering and this incentive, it's not just changing the opportunity cost of to pump or not to pump. It's also changing the opportunity costs of what to pump for, what crop to pump for.
Yeah.
And so in the net, these things could all change in different ways.
Yeah.
And for some farmers, it may mean that they end up, and again, I think we want to remember, selling electricity back to the grid does not necessarily mean you're using less electricity than before, right? Because a lot of these panels are fairly large. So I could increase my electricity consumption by 10%
And
sell electricity back to the grid. So I mean, using more electricity and selling electricity back to the grid. So it doesn't necessarily mean groundwater pumping has fallen.
Electricity is rationed, right, in India. So
Exactly.
the reason you can do that is because most places that have electricity only have a few hours of electricity, usually 3 or 4.
Precisely.
Which means suddenly you're going now with solar to 5-6 hours of electricity. So
exactly. The problem is in the net, the minute there's a technology change, it changes the incentives for a whole bunch of other things beyond the thing that we think it's doing. And so in the net, how these different decisions add up will widely range farm to farm to farm. And in the net, it's not clear whether in general, is electricity use actually going to fall? And the chances are, if I had to make a guess, based on my understanding of India and where these schemes are, I would argue and say that we should expect the reductions in electricity use to be very modest.
Yeah. We actually did a modeling study on this last year. I don't know if you saw that, but basically, net, that's really what it showed, because we looked at kind of Punjab being sort of a land limited system in the sense it's already all irrigated.
Exactly.
Bihar being, and Chhattisgarh being a place where it's energy limited in the sense, since there's a lot of diesel pumps. So that's one place where solar is actually reducing cost of electricity. So you're going to expect increase in abstraction. And then places like Karnataka, which are really water limited in the sense you're pumping to 1,000 feet and only 30% of the land is even irrigated. So there it wouldn't make sense at all to do it, because you don't have you've pumped out every last drop of water. So the only place you might expect it is in some place like Punjab, if you were able to actually make all that crop switching happen, and you were doing it in a place where you're actually reducing and not increasing the total energy endowment.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. It's called the Jevons paradox, right? You expect, you put a technology in and you say, oh, you can get the same thing done for less use of input. But the problem is that the technology changes other incentives as well. And so you use inputs more efficiently, but you also end up using more inputs. Called the Jevons paradox. Economists talk about it as the difference between the intensive and the extensive margin. That efficiency improvements on the intensive margin get crowded out by extensive margin changes. And that's what the Jevons paradox is essentially saying. So I would argue, just as you said, there are a number of these things like Pani Bachao, Paisa Kamao, this net metering of solar, including things like drip irrigation. They actually may have some role to play in a place like Punjab and Haryana. Because in Punjab and Haryana, every piece of land that can be cultivated is already cultivated with wheat and rice. And it's already irrigated. There is nowhere you cannot move to a more water-intensive crop. You cannot put more land under cultivation. You can't change your cropping, pattern in a manner that's more destructive for groundwater. You're just maxed out on all those margins. So in fact, a lot of these incentives may have a role to play in a state of Punjab. But what's going to matter in Punjab and Haryana is the manner in which they're introduced. I think trying to just drop it on farmers' heads and say, oh, from this day forth, we are charging you all for energy is not going to cut it. It's going to require working with farmers, extensions, saying, okay, we're helping you to move away from other things. We're going to secure some losses. It's going to require a whole bunch of those things. And again, I may want to, and this is the difference between, I think, a hydrologist and an economist. I will also argue that before we do any of that at scale, it may be important to think about, let's assume we were to slow down the problem in Punjab and Haryana. Who is going to benefit by slowing that problem down, right? So, for example, just to give a contrast, right? So the Chinese in the North China Plain, right? The North China Plain, again, has a lot of groundwater irrigation. It's a rice and wheat. It's a rice and wheat system. It's a wheat system in the winter, and a corn system in the summer. I think they grow corn in the summer, maize, and so as urbanization has increased in Beijing, and industries and residential areas have developed, the Chinese have become very interested in reducing groundwater extraction for agriculture. And the reason is because the value of this water, if you move it into industry or residential area, is significantly larger than its value in wheat production in winter. And so the Chinese government has a fallowing policy where they pay farmers to simply keep their land fallow. So don't cultivate your winter wheat, which means you don't extract anything. And farmers are paid to not do that. And they're often paid way more than what they would make had they cultivated the wheat and sold it. But it makes sense for the Chinese government to do this because the economics of it adds up. That they want to move this water from agriculture into domestic and industrial purposes. Now, in Punjab, let's assume we were to pay farmers to keep their land fallow. Let's look, and by the way, it's the same thing, right? I mean, paying farmers to slow down water use. The ultimate slowing down of water use is to say, don't cultivate one season, only cultivate the other. Let's assume we were to do that in Punjab. What would this water be used for? Where would this water go? Is it going to go into Is it going to go into industry? Is it going to go into residential services and residential water? Is that where the value of water is higher? Or it's not clear what the economics at that margin looks like. And so while, slowing down the problem may be hydrologically advantageous, I don't know what the economics of it are here, because it seems to me that this water's greatest use in Punjab is in agriculture. And so if slowing down the problem is just going to help agriculture be longer or continue longer without raising costs of production over time, maybe that's worth it too. But we don't know the answer to that either. And I think that's the thing that needs to be modeled or figured out.
Thanks, Soumya. So sort of walked us through various traditional policy instruments that might work in other settings, but also explored like how there are so many nuances in India and so much lack of information, so much heterogeneity that these instruments can be challenging to use, right? How do you think of information as a policy instrument again? And here, I mean, just to change context a little bit, you've done a lot of good work in, I think you ran a randomized control trial on information when it comes to water quality issues in groundwater, right, with arsenic contamination. So we've not talked at all about water quality so far. Yeah, in that context, just to start with, how do you see information as an instrument which changes behavior?
Oh, okay. So I think there are two questions out here, right? One is kind of what are the different policy instruments that are available for you in order to be able to sort of regulate water use, etc. And then sort of information as a policy. And then there's three pieces out there. So in general, what are the big policy instruments when we think about water, right? The traditional ones are all, you can price water, you can put a cap on the amount of water that you pull out. Those are broadly the two things, a price is kind of like a Pigouvian solution, a cap is kind of, giving rights to water or quotas of water, which is in a sense a Keynesian kind of solution if you think about it. So let me also say that doing it in any context is hard. Even in OECD countries, it's very hard pricing groundwater. It's very hard putting caps on water. I mean, look at California, right? So, California ostensibly has prices on groundwater, and, there are pockets and aquifers where there's moratorium on what you can do, what you cannot do, land use conversion, all kinds of different things, right? And what do we know about water in California? I mean, the news is not great, right? Think about water markets in Australia, right? I mean, and Australia keeps talking about their success of having all these water markets where farmers have quotas of water and they can trade these quotas. If you look at how these markets work, do they actually work in terms of making water use more efficient or helping helping communities or helping the government deal with water shortages during, let's say, dry years or drought years, right? Which are two different things. Efficiency is one thing, dealing with shortages through these instruments are actually two different things. They're not the same policy outcomes. But if you look at to what extent has both happened, it's highly variable. There is no one sort of, you see as many cases of, in fact, you may see things not working often more than things working, to be honest with you. The not working outcomes are, I think, fairly larger than the few pockets where things have worked. So I think we need to just accept that. And in general say that, this is a hard thing for anybody to do. In a context like India, where you have a history of really not doing much, you have very small farms, millions and millions of farmers, informal groundwater markets, and deeply entrenched poverty. It's not clear to me how you can practically implement pricing or quantity restrictions in a manner that is sensible and makes sense, and frankly also enforceable. So I think we need to just accept that and kind of take it for what it is. And I think in this context, I do believe that things like, as we talked about, things like extension, support, bridge insurance, they're also hard to do. They're not slam dunks or easy to do, but I think they hold a bit more promise than trying to put meters everywhere and trying to give quotas to farmers. It's just not practical. I don't think we should go down that road at all. So that's the first piece. The second piece was on information, right? And the use of information as sort of a policy instrument. And if you think about it, things like better extension, AWD recommendations at the village level, all this is better information. But I think information on its own is not going to cut it. You also have to provide other things with information in order for information to have some sort of a discernible impact on what people do and don't do. So in the case of AWD, it's like information about AWD support, extension, but also you may need, like I said, food for work, cash for work, that kind of stuff that kind of goes down there. And this is true. This is true for prices. This is true for quantities, but this is also true for information. These are all policy instruments that create marginal changes. They change the incentives at the margin. And frankly, what we're all looking for are discrete changes. So can we expect a bunch of marginal changes to add up to big discrete changes? I think that's mathematically not possible and physically not possible. So I think we need to keep that in mind as well. I remember the first thing that I learned sort of in a 101 environmental economics class was that, inefficiency, like something is so inefficient to extract and use, is the best friend of conservation. Nobody will use
Nobody wants it. Nobody wants it. It's too expensive.
Nobody wants it. Nobody wants to get their hand in it. Like, oh my God, it's who's going to bother with it, right? That or a monopolist. Because monopolistic pricing is such that,
you internalize all externalities.
Exactly. You will internalize externalities and always you will provide lesser quantities than perfect competition would, right? If you think about market structures in general. So oddly enough, if conservation is what we're interested in, we may have to sign ourselves up for making lives very difficult for people. So, and I don't mean to belittle the planet movement, or that's not what I mean. I'm simply saying that, we tend to use these words as if one means the other, and it doesn't. That's the reality of it. And I think we need to have some intellectual honesty to just say that. So finally, let's get to water quality, which we haven't talked about at all. It's a great question. Because if you think about most of the research on water, it's actually, we're still talking about regulating quantity, which really tells us how little progress we've made in the policy space. I mean, including, by the way, in OECD countries, right? We're still talking about, it's really about quantity and movement, and quality sort of comes in later. Now, where does water quality come in? Most of the discussions on water quality usually come in the wash space, right? Because it's drinking water. And what do you kind of regulate drinking water for? How do you go about doing it in a context where, you don't have centralized water sources? So what are your sort of points of entry, so to speak? I think that's what people are thinking about, right? So let's think about piped water, right? If you look at piped water in India, particularly in cities, in urban areas, or smaller cities, right? Tier 1, Tier 2 kind of cities. Piped water generally goes to people who can afford to pay for piped water. So this whole argument that we end up having around, we shouldn't increase the price of water because people can't afford it, I don't think that's backed up by evidence. Piped water in general goes to wealthy people, or people who can, at least if they're not super rich, but they can certainly afford to pay their water bills. People like you and me. I mean, we can afford to pay more for water in Bangalore and in Delhi, and I've lived in different parts of India. I can certainly afford to pay more for my water bills than what I have done. So I do think there is a case to be made for increasing water prices on piped water in urban areas. If you think about it, the poor are already paying for water, as Veena rightly pointed out, in many, many parts, including in urban spaces, right, where piped water doesn't go, water pressure is not good enough, newer housing localities where infrastructure is fairly poor, or even unregulated housing localities in cities, right, things that were not part of the urban plan but have suddenly become these informal housing settlements. Most of these households in these neighborhoods are already paying tankers to come and supply water. They're paying way more than people like Veena and I are. And so I think the whole idea, again, that the poor don't pay for water, it's not true in the agricultural space. It's also not true in the domestic space. The poor are actually paying for water. It's the rich that are getting subsidized. And actually, there's been some fantastic work done by colleagues at the World Bank which shows this very clearly, that piped water is actually piped water is available in the homes of the well-off, and by not raising prices on piped water, all we're doing is implicitly subsidizing the rich, which we should not be doing at all. So I actually think, and this is where I think data starts coming in, right? It's very hard to argue against. I mean, you can still choose not to do something, but if you have the data and the evidence, you can actually show it. Just as we should be, for example, like the census, which happens, or even the national NSSO, which happens in India every 5 years, should be collecting better data on how much people pay for water. And because the payment is not just through piped water, it's through tankers, it's through a whole bunch of different things. And I think we need to kind of do that. Then the question becomes, how do you regulate for water quality? So if you want to price piped water better, that automatically, again, what do you do with the revenues you raise? So if you're going to price water, okay, we're treating it, we're improving infrastructure. You can drink water straight from your tap. You don't have to put an AquaGuard or an RO system at home or whatever, right? So what do you use the revenues for is going to be important. So you improve quality of services, you improve quality of water, and people also say, yeah, I'm happy to pay more because at least, I'm getting this service at the end of the day. That's what you do in the piped space. That's what I would do in the piped space. When a lot of people are buying water from tankers, how do you regulate tankers? How do you go about making sure that, what is the price? Again, what do these tanker markets look like? So are tanker businesses colluding and setting prices? Is it some kind of oligopolistic kind of setup there? Is it competitive? Or are they just segmented monopolies where they say, this is your area, this is my area, you don't come into my area, I won't come into your area, and everybody's kind of, setting prices monopolistically? What's going on there? Do we need to regulate those prices? And more importantly, do we need to regulate how tankers themselves, spot inspection, are they clean, water quality testing, is your water, and where do you get the water from, right? Are you simply going ahead and pumping water from some place where agricultural water is supposed to be there and bringing it to cities, which is, by the way, happening. We know it's happening. And so, that kind of stuff would also be important, right? Where are they regulating? Where are they buying the water from? Where are the tankers sourcing their water from? What are they treating it for? What quality is it in when they sort of supply this water to people? I think those are other entry points that we could be doing. And then finally, for things like groundwater, where people are kind of pumping and using their own water, that's a much harder thing to do given the size of it. So, and there, some choices may have to be made about. So one is, in general, I think better data on hydrology would be helpful, right? So, for example, things like heavy metals. Are we testing there are, every village has sort of these testing wells, so to speak, right? I mean, they have these, where you can go and test for water, etc. How often are these being tested for heavy metals? How often are they being tested for different kinds of contaminants? And can we sort of be better? Can districts be better at giving this advisory? Because we do have a federal government, we do have districts that have budgets to do things. So can they be giving these, this information better at local levels that says, this is what we're noticing, here are some of the things you can do, here are some of the things that you cannot do. Thinking about, simple points of treatment. In general, people don't want drudgery. So if you give people technology that's very cumbersome for them to use, nobody's going to use it. So we have to also start thinking about, how do we just give people simple things that they can use well enough? And that kind of stuff can be done at the district level as well. So I think we need to distinguish between, I think there will be different policies and different approaches for different types of people in India. It's not even going to be the same thing for everyone.
Well, we're coming to, almost to the end of the hour. So actually, I wanted to take one step back. You've talked a lot about kind of all these amazing studies and a lot of evidence that's been generated from all of them. I was wondering, how often do all these policymakers that you work with, whether through your current position at the World Bank or your previous positions, actually pay attention to any of this evidence? And what do you see as the process by which all of this evidence eventually makes its way into shaping policy? Or does that not happen reliably enough or often enough?
I mean, I think policymakers are listening. And I think, and certainly quite a bit of the work that I have done has fed its way into policy and programming, for sure. But it's always baby steps. And sometimes the idea is good, the budget is not there because they committed themselves to something else. One of the things that I think that would be very helpful to turn more evidence into policy, I think, is thinking about trade-offs. Because you see, policy is about trade-offs at the end of the day. What are you gaining and what are you giving up, or what are you unintendedly kind of, there's an unintended consequence and you don't want that. So I think for research in general to move into, to have actual effect on thinking and decision-making, the scope of research itself needs to be, I don't mean that research needs to be less rigorous. It should be as rigorous as it is, but it needs to be a bit broader. And I think we need to think a little bit about trade-offs. Because the minute you say, oh, you could do this, a policymaker will be like, yeah, but if I do this, here are all the other things that could happen, and what do we know about this stuff, right? Because they have to think about that. So I think policymakers do listen. And I think when ideas are good, they are willing to try things. In general, it's a lot easier to... Here is an idea to do something better, and the idea involves giving something or introducing something. But unfortunately, there are also things where you have to stop doing some things. And I think the stop doing things is a lot harder for policy to do than the start doing things. And so I think for a lot of things that we are talking about, we may also need to stop doing some things. And I think that's much harder to do in policy. It's because it's kind of like, the horse. It's kind of like the horse has left the stable. How do we bring this horse back, right? And I think that's difficult to do. It's politically challenging to do. It's also just logistically tricky to do. So I think that's really hard for policy to kind of get into. And so I think part of it is also... to be honest, I mean, an idea may be a good idea in principle and on paper, but if it's not an implementable idea, it's not an implementable idea, right? So I think that's one thing that at least I take away from the stuff that I have done, and places where I have had, success in influencing policy. And the other is in the search for the perfect, let's not forget the good enough. A lot of research focuses on the first and the second best, not on the third, fourth, and sort of fifth kind of best, right? And that's got to do with the publication bias. It's just hard to publish things that are not sexy, so to speak. But policy is often about the third, fourth, and fifth best. And so we do need to do more research, more practical, action-oriented research in that space.
So you're saying we need to say things like, is this thing slightly less awful than the current awful thing we're doing?
In policy, in policy and in politics, both. Yes.
Yeah.
So, Soumya, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us on the Water Data podcast. Absolute pleasure to have you here. And dear listeners, so in our episode notes, we will put out links to some of Soumya's work. Please go check it out. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you. That's it for this episode of the Water Data Podcast. Thank you for listening till the end. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to the Well Labs YouTube channel and share this episode with your friends and colleagues. You can find the Water Data Podcast on all major podcast platforms. Until then, stay curious and stay connected. Thank you.